Hey, what's up, guys? I wanted to mix up the videos a little bit, but going back to the stuff I usually like, the Osprey stuff, the military stuff, from the perspective of the hated villains, of course, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians. In this case, the duel series here, dealing with the common theme between Japan and Germany, what they had to deal with, which was the night bombing. Of course, Germany was bombed in the day by the Americans with the so-called strategic bombing, but the night was the bombings was done by the British. I remember my grandfather telling me that as a kid, the first time I ever heard it was like, oh, he would say the Americans bombed in the day and the British would bomb at night. Of course, the British used area bombing and lots of incendiaries, as you can see. Ironically, the American Air Force adopted the similar tactic in dealing with the Japanese. You can argue for different reasons. Of course, there wasn't a lot of targets for them to hit, but the Japanese were very vulnerable with their paper and wood structures and other things to the incendiary bombing. Of course, the night fighters by both countries try to deal with this. It's interesting to see what the idea of the night can protect you, but it also makes it very difficult for you to find your target. Whether you're you're trying to hunt the bomber or the bomber is trying to hit the target. Very interesting things that I didn't even know. Obviously, how much can you know? Pretty much like usual Osprey, just everything. The painted original artwork, the photography, the profiles, the statistics. The interesting information. You could say it's pretty much military history. So a lot of it, you could argue, is pretty sound. Obviously, I've read stuff that I didn't totally agree with, but in terms of the numbers, it is sort of an interesting game here. What the Germans and the Japanese had to deal with uh, was very. You can argue that the of course the Lancaster. I gotta with my accent. I'm gonna say Lancaster, right, from where I live, but Lancaster bomber. With the four-engine bomber of the RAF, you can argue that the Germans had to deal with more of them, but they were sort of the Japanese with a lot less technology. Basically, had to deal with a much superior aircraft than the B-29 Super Fortress, and so obviously, there's interesting things that I read here. I was actually very shocked at something that I eventually realized when I read this one in particular. I would argue that the Lancaster, the RAF, Arthur Harris, so all the stuff I've gone over with Dresden and everything. This is the one. They always talk about the torpedo scandal in the American Navy. I would argue that the Lancaster, the bomber command, the use of these things over Germany. I would argue that this is a scandal, and I think there's a reason why Arthur Harris is called Butcher. Not even so much for the sympathy for the people being burned to death here, because they were Germans. Of course, I care because that's my blood. But well, you'll see. So we'll start with this with the German. Of course, typical Osprey, everything's good. The duel series. So they're gonna focus on the Messerschmitt Bf110, okay, versus the Avro Lancaster bomber. Essentially, this was the double-engine fighter, which were found to be wanting. They were not as maneuverable as single-engine fighters and were sort of decimated in the Battle of Britain when they were fighting head-to-head in the day. But they found new life as a night bomber because the night changes everything. Of course, the Avro Lancaster four-engine bomber, pretty much its main, what it was designed for was the bomb load. The thing with Arthur Harris was the bomb load, the amount of bombs this thing could drop, the tonnage they could drop on Germany was like the big thing for her. So there's a thing here with the bomb. Yeah, here's an example of it, right? The design of the Lancaster revolver round is huge, 33-foot long bomb bay, which can carry 14 1,000-pound bombs. Right, the ability to carry large bomb loads made it the preferred aircraft of bomber command. Of course, there were issues with this bomber, right? And you can always argue, well, they when they found out about it, they would immediately go fix it, but they didn't do that. Okay, and I'll just say it right here. What one of the biggest problems of it was. Let's see, just going through here, going through obviously the armament. One of the things was the fields of fire, of defensive fire, as you can see. the top and the front are sort of covered, but there's nothing on the bottom. Okay, but you have a real tail gunner, right? Well, these poor bastards. I don't know what else to say. Right here, many Lancaster rear gunners, right? These guys had 30mm machine guns, okay, which were actually not effective, even though there were 4 of them. Not very effective for the most part against armored German planes, the Bf110 in particular. But the German planes were armored. Right, combat experience indicated the rear gunner actually contributed little to the defense of the Lancaster, and the best form of protection was speed and evasive tactics. And you see that. What saves some of these Lancaster bombers is when they start juking and jiving and moving and just hitting the engines. These poor guys were a huge target. So now going through here with one of the tactics of the night fighter, okay, particularly when these things are equipped with radar, okay, that's the whole thing too. The radar game, both the radar systems on the plane, and the various countermeasures used against each other was as part of this fight as anything else. It's nighttime. You can't see your target, whether you're the bomber, and you can't see your target if you're the night fighter trying to find the damn thing. But this idea here, these guys were probably the most killed guys on these things. And also the bottom is totally open. Well, what's the big deal? What's the fighter going to do? Well, you're going to see what they're going to do. Because one of the infamous, and I've gone over this in other videos about aircraft, of course, one of the big factors, one of the weapons that was found to be very effective, originally done sort of like piecemeal, but eventually standardized, was the Schrag music, right? Basically 20mm cannons up at a 70mm angle. Okay? Basically, these planes would just fly under the Lancaster bomber. Okay? You want to see pictures? I'll show you pictures. They would just fly under these things and just start lighting these guys up. Okay? Or they would just kill this poor bastard outright. And there's a photo here, right here. Lancaster limped home, right, after being shot over the Berlin, right, the Battle of Berlin. I'll go over that at some other video. The night fighter pilot had used the standard von unten hinten tactic to kill both the rear turret and mid-upper turret gunners. They would just sneak up, and the Germans always said, when they talked to them after the war, the vast majority of these guys, they never saw the night fighter come up, whether underneath or behind them. When they would take out the rear gunner, they almost never got shot back. Okay, even though they didn't even have enough armament, really, they would shoot these things and not even ever get shot back. Okay, so, and like I said, very different from dog fighting. Look at this photo here, man. Firebombing Pforzheim. Oh man, this was a horrific battle for the RAF. Okay, many interesting things. The fact that they didn't update the machine guns for the Lancaster bombers. The fact that they even had they had a radar system called Monaco, which was not only useless for the crew, who were very young men, by the way, but also the Germans learned to use that to hone in on and find the Lancaster bombers. One of my favorite actors, Donald Pleasance, he was one of those Lancaster bomber crew members shot down. Okay, so it's interesting. You saw too that, of course, the 2-man Bf110 Messerschmitt night fighter, you could see that they had the Bordfunker, the radio guy originally, the backup pilot, right? He had to become a highly technical electronic warfare specialist. The success increasingly depended on the skill of this guy, because there was a lot of jamming going on. These guys started to become masters of using the radar equipment to try to find the enemy. Obviously, Bomber Harris was concerned with the payload of how much he could drop on Germany, and just keep going at it. I'm gonna be frank. There's so many stupid pig-headed things that this man did to his own men. That's why they called him Butcher Harris. Okay, whatever he did to my mother's people, this guy got a lot of the Lancaster bomber crew members killed. And it's interesting, there were guys who revolted, guys who were, I guess, court-martialed or whatever, who refused to fly. Essentially, the rate of attrition they had, it made it impossible. Almost every, well, I'll show you a graph. I'm getting a little emotional here, but I couldn't believe this stuff. This was a scandal. You can say, oh, you weren't there. This was a scandal. Okay, I'll show you the graph here. We'll, of course, paint the artwork here. Also, the Lancaster bomber had very narrow escape hatches. So usually when it was on fire, the guys would roast alive. Right here, it says everything. The amount built and the amount lost. They were basically shooting down and destroying. At least half the bombers built each month were shot down and by the Germans. A catastrophic rate of loss. Essentially, 44% of the RAF Lancaster bombers. Okay, and also you have the Halifaxes and the Sterlings also really catching it. For the Lancaster bomber crews, there was a 44% death rate. That's shocking. I can't believe they didn't go after this guy after the war. Forget what he did to the enemy from their point of view. 44% death rate of your bomber crews, of your young men. I'm shocked. The Germans were probably shocked too. So, and here's two heroes here. Okay, between these two men, they destroyed a staggering 223 Allied aircraft. Half of these were Lancasters, right? And in the end, the Lancaster bomber, it never really did. It didn't end the war. You had to have the guys on the ground go in and do a number. Plus, with the Americans helping them. Absolute scandal. I fucking hate Arthur Harris even more now. So these poor lads, I don't blame the fucking guys. What the fuck you gonna do? You're in the military. You're gonna fucking go. You're gonna do what you're told. I'm not stupid. Okay, even though what I see here, but Jesus Christ, man, try to save your own fucking guys.